There's a number of trends going on. Perhaps one of the more important is vehicle automation. So if you're looking at over a 20 or 30-year time horizon, it's highly likely that most vehicles on the road will be automated most of the time. So we will not necessarily have truck drivers in the cabins of trucks. Instead, we'll have trucks that are automated, driven by cameras. Perhaps there'll be a remote control center somewhere where someone's managing 8 or 10 trucks or more, just like air traffic control, to ensure that if there's an issue, they can deal with the issue that the computer algorithm might not be able to handle. But for most purposes, the trucks are moving themselves along the highway at a steady rate of speed, essentially 24 hours a day. So the automation trend is an important one. There's increasing demand for logistics services as consumers switch their travel patterns. Historically, people went out shopping and brought stuff home, and so they were their own logistics service for the last mile. But we've been moving towards a shipping model. UPS and FedEx and the US Postal Service are the most visible signs of that. And that's grown significantly as online retail has grown to be from 0% of sales 20 years ago to somewhere around 10% today, and we can certainly foresee that would be much higher. So the last mile shipping problem is going to be much more significant. There's going to be changes in the fuels that are used in vehicles. For automobiles, we're moving towards electrification, and over a 20, 30-year period, that seems to be likely. Trucks, that may or may not occur, but we might be switching away from diesel towards biodiesel or other types of commercial fuels. So there's a number of patterns that are affecting how commercial vehicles are going to change over the next few decades. There's 4 states that have passed laws pertaining to automated vehicles, but it's not clear that it's illegal in the other states. People have driven cars autonomously in other states, have not been pulled over or arrested. The law is ambiguous on this, and there are legal scholars who argue that it is legal everywhere. It is not explicitly illegal. So I think it's actually legal in most states. It's just that laws have been specifically written in a few states for it. So I think that's an important point. The forces in favor of this, in general, the public should be in favor of it because of improved safety, improved fuel economy, less burden on the driver. There will need to be some legal precedent set over liability issues, and that will come in due time as there are ultimately crashes that involve autonomous vehicles, and perhaps crashes where the autonomous vehicle might be at fault. The evidence to date is that that's going to be far fewer crashes than we have now. So overall, there'll be a lot of gains to the system, and one expects that the court will sort that out as it does other types of product liability issues. So I think that there's a lot of worry now about how the liability will sort itself out. But 10 or 15 years from now, this will be crystal clear, and we will have figured out who bears what. It might be that the automakers take on the role of the insurance companies. And so instead of getting your own insurance, the automaker is selling you the insurance as part of the product because they're going to be held liable one way or the other, and this helps sort that out. It's going to be complicated in the first few years because there's the issue of the driver assuming control of the vehicle sometimes. So we have this potential where we have vehicles that are automated some of the time, but not all of the time. And when they're automated part of the time, and then the automated system says to the driver, take responsibility now, and we need to do that in the next 6 seconds. Well, does the driver do that in the next 6 seconds, or the next 2 seconds, the next second and a half? And how does that get resolved? The Google model of the vehicles being autonomous all of the time and there being no steering wheel and nothing for the driver to be involved with is a much cleaner model. So Google is pushing sort of pure automation, and the vehicle manufacturers are going the other direction, much more incremental, where we have, as today, we have adaptive cruise control, where we have lane departure warning systems, so lane guidance, lane keeping. And on a freeway, the car can drive itself now. There are a few models out there that do drive themselves now in freeway conditions, but they don't do well in off-freeway conditions, on local streets, on local roads. The Google model works very well where everything is already has mapped in a lot of detail, and they have test runs that they do that in. So these two models are going to be competing. In the end, I think the Google model of full automation will win. The question is, do we get there in one large step, or do we get there in incremental steps? And at what point do we take the steering wheel away? And what point do we have cars driving themselves without anybody aboard? Which is sort of the ideal for the freight industry in particular. So I think these questions are going to be important. People are nervous about new technology. I think younger people are more accepting of it than older people. I think, in general, very young drivers are certainly more dangerous than middle-aged, and even sort of senior drivers. Very old drivers are also more dangerous than middle-aged drivers. So there's this U-shaped curve as you go with age versus safety, and that's been well established in the literature. But all drivers will be better off if they are. Society will be better off if all drivers are replaced with autonomous vehicles from a safety perspective, and people will figure that out. It's like today we worry about plane crashes, but planes hardly ever crash. Very few people die in plane crashes. We go years where nobody gets killed in a commercial aviation crash in the United States now. We will eventually get to the point where instead of 30,000 people getting killed in cars, we might be in the hundreds or tens of people who are getting killed by in cars. And instead of it's the story being routine, the story will be national news, just as an air crash is today in national news. Even if only one or two people die on board an airplane, it's national news. So that kind of risk perception problem faces the public in all sorts of things. And we think a lot of things are far more dangerous than they are if we experience them infrequently, and a lot of things are safer than they are when we experience them frequently. But we're going to shift over slowly and get more and more used to this idea as it becomes more real, as people get experience with it. There's lots of questions that are going to be involved. How are people going to respond to someone else driving them? Is it going to feel like another driver, or is it going to drive in a different style? Is it going to be jerkier or smoother? Is there going to be motion sickness issues? I mean, those kinds of things will get resolved, but the first model will not be as good as the next model. And so we need to recognize that this is going to be an evolution that takes place over time. And it's not like one day we're going to replace all of the cars or trucks on the road. Instead, over 10 or 20 years, old cars will get phased out of the system and new cars will be brought in. And eventually, and sort of a rough timeline would be today to 2020, you can start to buy these autonomous cars. By 2030, all new cars will be autonomous. And by 2040, old cars won't be allowed to be driven except on Sunday afternoons. Well, I guess the question is, do you think that Federal Express and UPS have special skills in delivery, or they can be replaced by amateurs? And, for some things that there might not be any particular skill involved, and there's not, you can hire someone off the street and they can do delivery. But for other types of things, well, they're not going to do it very efficiently, and they're not going to do it cost effectively, and you'll be concerned about the tracking, and you'll have to vet the people. And so I think that there's a case to be made that last mile delivery has a real economy of scale and is best done by professional organizations with professional staff who know what they're doing, and that it's not like pizza delivery. And again, it depends. There might be markets that are like pizza delivery, and you can hire somebody off the street and they don't need any special training. And there are other things that you want to make sure that are delivered properly and carefully, and everything is scanned and somebody knows the route and who the customers are, and make sure to leave it in a safe place and all those kinds of things. And over a 30-year period of time, we might get other things. I mean, Amazon has proposed, using drones for delivery, which, at first blush seems silly, but then, if you can get the economics of it right, if you can get the energy consumption of it right, and you've got distribution points that are located throughout the city, and then you just go from a local distribution point to somebody's house and leave it on the front step, and it's not a terribly valuable item where you don't need a human interface, that might be something that works real well. I mean, in 30 years, we might have, instead of a UPS driver being a human, the UPS driver might, of course, the vehicle might be driven robotically, but you might actually have a robot which would take the good from the truck to the front door. There might be other types of local freight delivery systems. People have talked about replacing the freight delivery at the last mile with lock boxes, things like PO boxes traditionally. So instead of stuff being delivered to your house, you go to a local neighborhood pickup place. And this could save several dollars per package. And that might be enough to encourage people to do that some percentage of the time. So we might move more towards people will do some of their pickup more than they do now for certain types of things. And for other types of things, instead of going shopping, it gets delivered to them. And we're going to see this explosion of different economic models over the next few years, and we're seeing it already. And what the winners will be is unclear. Different people are making different bets. If everyone agreed on what the future would be, we wouldn't have people making bets that are some of which are going to turn out to be wrong. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. And I think there's a lot of potential experiments here, mixing the location of distribution hubs, mixing who does the pickup and who does the delivery, and what is bought online versus what is bought in person, and whether the delivery is done by professionals versus amateurs. And it's not clear at all how that turns out. Well, we've probably reached peak big box. There's probably as many big box stores as there are going to be. And it probably takes as much of consumer spending as it will. And so in the future, we're going to be moving towards less of that and more continued increasing in online purchases as a substitute. And so we might have, for stocks, your paper towels and so on, you might just have a regular subscription service. Amazon's also testing this really interesting button that you just, it's a $2 electronic chip that you put next to your, let's say, laundry detergent. And when you're out of laundry detergent, you push the button and it automatically tells Amazon that you're out of detergent, and they will deliver you the next one. And it will show up on your doorstep, and you don't need to be home because it's laundry detergent. And there's probably not too many people are going to steal laundry detergent from your front doorstep. And maybe you'll have a local box that the UPS guy can drop stuff in and you can pick it up out of a drop box or something like that, either on your step or in the neighborhood. And this kind of model can replace even things that you'd say, well, it's a commodity and it's really low value. Well, it might not be urgent, but you can have different priorities for different types of shipping. And it gets there, over the next few days instead of getting there in the next hour. And then there's other things which are going to be more urgent. And there are a lot in large cities now. There are delivery services that are testing delivery of groceries. We've had, of course, grocery delivery over, decades ago, and that was a common thing. But coming back so that people will say, I need groceries. They'll go online, they'll order the groceries, and they'll be delivered in a few hours in large cities. And this model, again, is going to be very successful in places where you have critical mass. So a friend of mine in Manhattan said that below the grocery stores in Manhattan, there are garage fulls of local delivery trucks, and that there are lots of people, Amazon Fresh and so on, that are buying these services and expecting 1-day delivery or 6-hour delivery or 1-hour delivery for certain types of things. And they're able to get it. And how big that market is waits to be seen. But that's not much like the big box. So the big box is going to be more like a warehouse where the consumer doesn't go in, but orders from, and it's locally delivered by a third party. So that kind of model is also possible. A wants-based, an on-demand delivery system where I can order something and get it in the next couple of hours is very possible in large cities. Less likely in rural areas just because the density isn't there to justify the delivery service. It's more expensive to deliver over longer distances. So you'll see different types of services in different areas, and where the boundaries are, do first ring suburbs get the urban level of service, or do they get the rural level of service? Where is that boundary drawn? Waits to be seen. Depends on the economics of the situation. Depends on whether you can take labor out of it. So if you can get robots doing the actual delivery to the front doorstep rather than people, things that are too expensive now because you have to pay labor become much less expensive. So this is something that will transition and become more possible as there's less labor involved in the system, assuming robots can be mass manufactured with these skills for a reasonable price, which we're sort of taking as a given. I expect will be true, but it hasn't actually happened yet. So we're a little bit ahead of the game on predicting that. But, in everybody's future, we have sentient robots. So one imagines we'll have robots that'll be able to do deliveries to people's homes over the next 3 decades. I think we already see more state and local responsibility for funding highway projects now, and the federal share has been diminishing since 1998. So, there hasn't been a gas tax increase since 1993, and they took some of that and we're spending on reducing the budget deficit for the first few years. But we're now almost to 20 years where there's been no increase in the federal gas tax, and there has been increased federal spending, but that's coming out of general revenue. The question of whether the federal government continues to play a significant role in transportation, I think is being answered slowly in the negative, that it's phasing out. It's not going to eliminate the gas tax, but there's no strong desire to increase it significantly and create a new infrastructure push. The last opportunity for that was in 2009 with the stimulus bill. And I don't think we've seen any desire to do anything at the federal level since then. Now, states will pick up this. The states want to make sure that their highways are in good condition, and will be maintaining that. And I think the most significant problems that we have are on local roads in terms of condition, because the funding for local roads comes out of general revenue at the local level, typically property taxes. People, of course, don't want to see their property taxes go up. If we could move towards a more direct highway user fee system, a vehicle mileage tax of some form or another, and there's lots of nice names for it, but essentially it's a tax for every mile that you travel, and locals could take advantage of that, I think that would be a strong infusion into infrastructure funding. That's not likely in the next few years, but there's going to be a coming crisis of the gas tax. I mean, we're starting to see it now. Gas tax revenues declining because of better fuel economy and because there's less travel per capita. But over the next few years, we expect to see even better fuel economy. Federal government corporate average fuel economy standards are continuing to rise. So the amount of revenue raised per vehicle is going to go down. And more electric vehicles are going to be on the road, which don't pay any gas tax at all. And so that's the opportunity, I think, to switch over to a mileage-based charge. And as we electrify the fleet and we start charging electric vehicles per mile, we'll have the opportunity to get new revenue into the system, and adjusting the rate once it's a per mile tax and more clearly a user fee is probably a little bit easier than raising the gas tax. Not that either of those is politically easy. One of the things that we probably should be doing, I'm not predicting that we will do this, but that we should do, is to treat public roads more like a public utility, like electricity and natural gas, and less like a branch of government. And then they would obviously need their separate funding source in order to maintain them at a certain level of service. And people would say, well, what level of service do you want? What condition of roadways do you want? What level of congestion are you willing to accept? And then this is how much it costs to achieve that, just as we do with electricity. And even if it's publicly owned, just this kind of political separation, so that it isn't a vote that legislators have to make to raise the gas tax, but instead it's a decision the Public Utility Commission makes, I think is a model that we should move towards. Other countries do things that are somewhat similar to this, Australia and New Zealand in particular, and I think we would be well served moving in that direction. I think it's going to be difficult to shift politically, but if we ever make that shift, it's probably going to come as the gas tax goes away, because we stop using gasoline as the primary fuel. Yeah, I think smart highways and connected vehicles are mostly a non-starter. I think we need to distinguish between autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles. Autonomous vehicles, all the intelligence is in the vehicle yourself, and you're not dependent on anything else. With connected vehicles, you're communicating with other vehicles, and there's going to be rules that require all new vehicles to have chips in them and basically broadcast a "here I am" message, which tells other vehicles that are receiving this that there is a vehicle at this point with a particular coordinate and a particular trajectory. And that's great, but unless all vehicles have this, you can't really rely on it, and you can't rely on all vehicles having it without having some sort of verification by having the sensors on board your vehicle in the first place. So the added value from connected vehicles is pretty low. Making infrastructure smarter is even farther. We can't even keep our roads, especially our local roads, free of potholes. The likelihood that we're going to make them somehow smart is, I think, far-fetched. We don't have any desire to make infrastructure investments in making our traffic signals more intelligent. And there might be a few test cases where we do this, but the likelihood of this being deployed widely enough that it makes an important difference, I think, is pretty small. Traffic signals are managed by, tens of thousands of different municipalities in the US. Many of them don't even have a full-time traffic engineer on staff. They're not going to have any desire to upgrade the signal controller cabinet that they installed 40 years ago as long as the lights turn from red to green. I mean, they'll change a bulb that's out, but they're not going to want to change the intelligence in that because it works, it does what it needs to. And so I think that the prospect of connected vehicles and smart highways is much lower than the prospect of autonomous and smart vehicles themselves.
So do you think it's more of a cost pain point, or are there some security issues with that vehicle-to-vehicle or vehicle-to-infrastructure type scenario that would also be of concern, where those things might be able to actually be hacked, or some reliability issues as well?
Well, those exist too, but I think it's primarily an institutional coordination issue. The cost of putting the chips into cars is pretty small. The cost of upgrading the infrastructure is not small, but it's certainly well within the capacity of the United States to fund if we wanted to. And if other countries did it, we might decide to copy them. But we're so decentralized as a country, it's unlikely we'll get that everywhere. There are certainly other issues about security, and a poorly designed system would be insecure and would be unfortunate. Hopefully those would be addressed. One can't count on that in advance, but hopefully that, somebody hacking the traffic signals has a limited amount of downside risk. Somebody knowing where your car is has a limited amount of downside risk. But will somebody be able to log into your car and turn it off remotely? Well, General Motors OnStar does things like that now. And, so there's already that type of minimal connection between the automaker who you're subscribing a service for. They know where your car is. They can unlock your car for you remotely. They can do some other things. I mean, right now they can't drive your car for you, I guess, or apply the brakes, but one imagines with software they'd be able to do that remotely. The question is, do you want them to do that? And do you want anyone to be able to do that? And so I talked at the beginning about driverless trucks and perhaps being centrally managed as a fleet. Will we want our cars to be managed in a similar way, where someone is monitoring a dozen cars or 100 cars, and if there's an issue, steps in and does something, but in most of the time, everything just moves smoothly of its own accord. So we might be connecting them separately to these, to your General Motors OnStar or your Daimler-Benz truck fleet management system, or whatever they're going to market, so that you can manage your fleet with much less labor. But do we want that to be controlled by the government? Do we want the government to be able to log into this? Do we want it to be an open system that runs over the internet, or it runs over some private network that's not connected? And how do you screen that off? I think there's issues there, but I think those are issues that we're not even going to get close to, because we're not going to be making the investment in our infrastructure in the first place. So it's just a question of, are the vehicles connected centrally to somebody who's managing them for you, or are they totally autonomous? And General Motors thinks that OnStar is a business. Other automakers would like to keep, sort of continue to get a service revenue from that kind of thing. But on the other hand, do they want the liability of, they should have applied the brakes to the car and didn't, because they were theoretically capable of monitoring the car and didn't? So I think those kinds of issues still need to get sorted out. And my guess is the automakers are going to say they don't want to be remotely in charge of your car. They want it to be locally, because there's too many potential sources of error in terms of, this whole chain of, communicating through the cell phone network, even if it's a private cell phone network, and signal latency and lag and all of those kinds of things. They don't want to be remotely applying brakes to cars in real time, because you have too much potential for things to go wrong in the chain. I mean, I suspect it'll have some effects over the longer term, but there aren't going to be that many post-Panamax ships ready to use it on day one, because we have this existing fleet of ships that you wouldn't have wanted to make too large because it wasn't going to be able to go through the Panama Canal. So how much of the shipping fleet gets reallocated to the Panama Canal routes versus serving their existing routes it's one of these things that's going to take a while to play itself out. New ships coming online, in over the next decade or so, I think we'll see larger changes. So that's one issue. The capacity of East Coast ports is another issue, and how much cities on the East Coast are going to want their ports to expand to handle these larger ships, and whether the ports themselves will be large enough to handle these ships, I think is still an issue. So again, this is something that over time can be rectified, but isn't necessarily in place now. And then the third issue is how much additional freight movements are we going to have? We've seen in a number of developed countries, essentially peak freight per capita. There's only so much tonnage that an individual person is going to consume in a year. And as devices get smaller, as electronics get smaller, as the things that we buy overseas continue to reduce in size, we're not going to need as much stuff to be shipped. And so I think that is, competing against this opportunity. Reducing the cost of shipping stuff makes it easier to ship stuff long distance. Automation of manufacturing makes it easier to produce stuff locally. So if everything is manufactured automatically, there's no advantage to having a factory in China or Africa rather than anywhere in the United States. And I think that means that there's not necessarily going to be that much more international shipping, because automation is not just playing out in transportation, and it's playing out in manufacturing and in food production and these other sectors. So it's not at all clear that there's more material that we need to be buying from the other side of the world that has to get shipped through the Panama Canal. Now, certainly in the short term, some things will be, but I think there's a limit to that. And so the projections, the extrapolations of freight growth that go like this, and we've seen them, which basically say, well, freight tonnage per person has grown for, more than a century. It'll continue to grow at the same rate. I think those are probably as wrong as the passenger growth curves were, that were doing the similar type of thing. And we saw from 1920 to 2000, steady increase in per capita travel in the United States. But around 2000, the curve bent, and travel's been essentially flat for a decade and a half now per person. It still grows with population a little bit, but it's dropping per person. Well, freight shipments per person will also probably drop as we reach a more dematerialized state, and as we can manufacture more things locally because manufacturing is more automated. So that's going to be, we still have some rising population, but 2050 or so, which is only 35 years out, there are some forecasts that's peak population. It might be somewhere between 2050 and 2100. And so these long-term demographic trends say that there is an upper limit to how much stuff that we can actually get shipped. And as we get more efficient with things will get smaller. Packaging will get more efficient and smaller. So the volume can be reduced in addition to the tonnage being reduced.